Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Panay, and in today's podcast we'll be discussing freedom. A Course in Miracles talks a lot about prison. There are several passages where it uses the word, and basically it's describing the world as a prison. So if we identify with sin, then we'll perceive that we're being punished, that the world is a prison in which we're punished for our sin of separation, that we believe we separated from God. And so we'll anticipate punishment, retribution, rejection from the world. We'll expect it, and therefore we'll see it. And so the world is like a prison house. Here are some quotes from the Course. This is from a section called The Self-Accused in chapter 31. If you are sin, you lock the mind within the body and you give its purpose to its prison house, which acts instead of it. A jailer does not follow orders, but enforces orders on the prisoner. So here it's describing the body as a prison house, the body as our jailer that enforces orders on us. It's our body we perceive when we're in our ego that causes us to feel pain, suffering, rejection, that causes us to feel limited, weak, and vulnerable. And we feel that we couldn't feel any other way as bodies in a world in which we are fighting with everybody else, figuratively, if not literally, for resources. If we see ourselves as bodies and everybody else as bodies, and that's what's foremost in our mind, then we will see competitive interests everywhere. And we will feel vulnerable, and the principle of scarcity will be uppermost in our mind. And in that respect, we are slaves to our bodies. And in that respect, our bodies are our jailers, are our prisons. And when you think of prison, what else do you think of in terms of limited freedom? Well, we think of a limited freedom of choice. We can't necessarily choose exactly what we want for dinner. It'll be determined by what's served up by the prison. We can't determine when we get up, when we shower, when we have recreation. We can't determine what cell we sleep in. So freedom of choice is the main signifier of being in a prison. And the Course reminds us that when we think we are choosing between A or B, doing A or B or having A and B out there in the world, and we're identified with our ego, and we think the most important thing is this outer choice we make out there between A or B, that choice is really no choice at all. Because when we're looking through the ego's eyes, we'll always be perceiving through the eyes of a competitive situation or a sacrificial situation where in choosing for A, B has to be sacrificed and vice versa. And also that somebody's needs will need to be sacrificed. Somebody will end up better off from the choice we made and somebody will end up worse off from the choice we make. If we take something tangible, material from someone, then that means they don't have it anymore, and so we'll perceive them as being worse off. So the Course tells us that whenever we're choosing in the world with our ego, there aren't no real choices being made, because whatever we choose, there are no real alternatives. Whether we choose A or B, we are choosing for guilt, because we'll perceive with the ego's eyes and believe in deprivation, sacrifice, and a one or the other mentality. Well, that is no choice at all. Now, this idea that either one is a choice for guilt can sometimes not be very evident. We think, oh, I'm choosing A or B, no big deal. We're not really thinking, oh, but now somebody else can't have it because I got it. But when we are choosing with our ego, and that means making that outer thing the big deal, we are still choosing for guilt and that one or the other thought system, and so it will be affecting us. Now, if we want a very clear, extreme example of the one or the other thought system being played out whenever we think that the big decision is between A or B out there, we can look at what's called the trolley problem, which is a thought experiment devised in philosophy when discussing ethics. So let's discuss the trolley problem. Picture this. there's a train line, and somewhere along that line, it diverts into two pathways. On the left, which is the pathway it will naturally go towards unless somebody intervenes, there are 5 railway workers on the line who have no idea that the train is coming and they can't hear it. They've got earphones on, and which is really silly, but for the sake of the exercise, that's what's going on. Now, the right branch, there is 1 railway worker on the line who likewise can't hear the train coming, has no idea. The train is travelling at such a speed that it will kill the 5 railway workers because that's the track it's going along, and it's going so fast and they have no clue, it's going to obliterate them. You are standing nearby a lever which you can pull, which will divert the train onto the right track where there's only 1 railway worker. What do? That is the only option that you have in this scenario. The only thing you can do is either do nothing and let the train carry along and wipe out the 5 railway workers, or you can pull the lever which makes the train turn to the right track and kill 1 railway worker. What do? Well, this problem is designed to generate a discussion and flush out ideas about what is valuable in life. For example, if you have what's called a utilitarian approach, you will always just look at the end result, and it's very kind of black and white. Okay, the good thing would be to pull the lever because it's 1 death, but you've avoided the 5 others. Other people would say, well, no, that's no good at all because, how can you weigh up value of life like that? Basically, there's no answer. There's no right or wrong answer to this problem. But for the sake of our discussion, you can see this is a really difficult choice if you are looking in terms of form. Is there any good answer? What I'm going to read now is an essay I wrote called The Only Remaining Freedom. This essay was written in response to finding out a little bit about Hannah Arendt and an essay she wrote after witnessing the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was an architect of the Holocaust. Well, the topic in her essay is, broadly speaking, what do you do when it seems like there is no choice? Hannah Arendt makes the point that in order to be a person and not a mindless cog in a machine, it is essential that you always maintain that you have some choice. But what that choice is, we'll see as I read through this essay. So the essay again is called The Only Remaining Freedom, and it is from Volume 1 of Reflections on A Course in Miracles. Hannah Arendt was a German-American political philosopher who caused controversy in 1963 with the publication of Eichmann in Jerusalem, her report on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, an architect of the Holocaust. Arendt was struck by the apparent ordinariness of Eichmann. He didn't appear to be a monster, exhibit any traits distinguishing him from the everyday person in the street, or hate the victims of the final solution he helped orchestrate. Like so many other war criminals of the time, and many more since, Eichmann insisted that he had simply obeyed orders, that he wasn't, therefore, an active chooser in the situations before him, but rather a personless cog in an overarching machine. Arendt's main point was that harm to others is sometimes done by ordinary people who refuse to be persons, who refuse to see that there is any choice available to them, who refuse to think. Arendt wondered if even in the most impossible of situations, where resistance to unjust or inhumane orders seems impossible, there still remains a choice. Perhaps there is something between resistance and cooperation. Only thinking, says Arendt, will provide us with an opportunity to discover if that possibility exists. In impossible situations, thinking is our only remaining freedom. Subtitle: Thinking Fresh. The kind of thinking Arendt meant wasn't our everyday, unreflective and unoriginal kind of thought that seems to have a life of its own. Arendt was greatly influenced by Socrates, who responded to the Delphic oracle's announcement that he, Socrates, was the wisest man in Athens by saying, "If that is so, then it's because I know that I know nothing." For Socrates and Arendt, the best thinking comes from letting go of all habitual judgment and perceptions, all preconceived notions of what is right or wrong, beautiful or ugly. Particularly in times of political crisis, where public rhetoric reaches fever pitch, this kind of fresh thinking is the only thing that keeps the individual from becoming a slave to the dictates of the majority, a cog in a machine. Fresh thinking therefore protects our personhood, particularly when the chips are down. In relation to A Course in Miracles, fresh thinking can only occur when we've chosen to listen to the Holy Spirit as our teacher rather than the ego. This is because the ego thought system roots us in the past, whereas the Holy Spirit avails us of an ever-present, transcendent now. A Course in Miracles reminds us that no matter what goes on in the world around us, we have the power to choose with whom we want to approach the situation. The only remaining freedom lies within our mind, where we can make this choice for the separating thoughts of the ego or the healing thoughts of the Holy Spirit. Here's a quote from the Course. "In this world, the only remaining freedom is the freedom of choice, always between two choices or two voices, the Holy Spirit or the ego." End of quote. Through the process of forgiveness, the blocks to fresh thinking are removed, and we can act in the most helpful way to all people concerned. Challenging circumstances bring our perceptions of relationships to the fore. In every seemingly impossible situation, there can seem to be only one choice: who will win and who will lose. And in wartime, this can literally be expressed as kill or be killed. None of us can say how we would behave in extreme circumstances that highlight the one or the other aspect of the ego thought system, but we can help ourselves by remembering that no matter what our circumstance, we are free to bring our attention back to our mind and ask for help to look at our judgments based on differences. We will see victims and victimizers, good people and bad, oppressors and oppressed, and we will hate and empathize accordingly. The external problem, however, is always a mirror to our mind. Just as I see an impossible one or the other situation before me, I have an unconscious belief in a one or the other situation between myself and God, namely, that my separate existence is real and came at the cost of God's oneness. All fear comes from this belief in separation, this ontological one or the other situation that appears externally as, quote, some twisted form of the original error, end of quote. My external situation now becomes an opportunity for healing as I ask for help to see beyond the separate interests of everyone involved to our shared need, to know of our wholeness and home. The victimizers and victim in form, perhaps sharply drawn in the circumstance before us, have this one need in common, and in recognition of this common ground, we offer a remembrance of oneness to all parties because we are joined at the level of mind that chooses the Holy Spirit's vision. Quote, "Therefore release him merely by your claim on brotherhood." End of quote. This is how we make room for truth, by moving beyond the temptation to hate or to go on autopilot, to abstain from responsibility, or even to be a hero. We open our mind to an influence removed from the external situation, yet with total knowledge of what is the most helpful response for all people concerned. This is something we could never know of ourselves, but we don't have to. Our one responsibility is to remember our only freedom and choose to make use of it. If we practice this faithfully in the seemingly small instances of one or the other we encounter daily, this stands us in good stead when faced with situations that appear to present a much greater challenge. And that's the end of the essay. So just as Hannah Arendt says that to be a person, to accept your personhood, is to accept your ability to choose, to not say, I didn't have a choice and therefore didn't think about it, went on autopilot and just went along with things. we can apply similar thinking in line with A Course in Miracles by saying to accept that you are a mind and not a body, you need to accept that the most important choice or the only remaining freedom lies within your mind between the choice for either listening to the ego or the Holy Spirit. That is how you accept your mindhood and immediately escape from the prison of the body and the prison of the world. That is how you accept your freedom. That is how you choose for your freedom. I think with all that's going on in the world at the moment, and there's a lot of flux, a lot of conflict, a lot of division into opposites. If you're familiar with alchemy, you'll know that when you're going through a transformational process, one of the first steps is disorientation and disintegration before reorientation and integration. And that's always into a higher form of unity. But in alchemy, there is also another principle within that process. The unity cannot occur, or the reunification cannot occur, unless it's in the presence of Mercury. And Mercury is that bridge between the spiritual and the physical, because Mercury is not quite a solid, not quite a liquid. And so it's that hard to define presence that can kind of straddle two worlds. And that can be likened to the presence of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is aware of the world that we believe we are in, the illusory world, but it also is in touch with the real world and the reality of heaven. So it can bridge that gap. And that is why it's so important that we ask the Holy Spirit for help in our perceptions of what's going on the outside, so that we can come to some healing integration within ourselves of all that we judge harshly going on in the outside. So that is how we can be of best help in the present day to heal what comes up for ourselves in terms of our judgments of the outer stuff that's going on. But that doesn't mean that we don't necessarily partake in civil movements or not, because everybody has a different classroom in this world. And if you feel called in terms of a sense of vocation to partake in movements, then by all means do that. That is your classroom. If you don't feel called, then also it would be a mistake to feel pressured to do something out in the world in relation to certain issues that you feel are important or don't feel are important. The importance is not to judge people for their classrooms, but whether you do or you don't get involved in outer activities regarding things that are going on in the world, the most important thing is to go within first and to check in with yourself, to check in with your projections, to check in with your judgments, and that you make the whole process about healing your mind and thereby being of the most help to other people as well. Because if you don't make healing your mind a primary or the primary aim really, then you will get stuck in an oppositional stance to something out there. And pretty soon you will start to be expressing certain traits of the opposite you are despising out there. That's just how it goes. The shadow will come out. This is what happened with the French Revolution, with the intellectuals and the Enlightenment period and the focus on equality and that idealism. I mean, wonderful idealism, not having a go at that. But when the revolution happened, only about a year later, after the overthrow of the monarchy, the reign of terror began. The revolutionary rulers actually had a decree, and I quote, "Terror is the order of the day." It was a brutal, brutal time in which the revolutionary rulers employed secret surveillance out in the villages, in the towns, in the cities to weed out any critics of the new government. Now, here are some interesting stats. The reign of terror lasted about 9 months, and within that short period of time, over 300,000 suspects were arrested, 17,000 were officially executed and 10,000 died in prison or without trial. All of that within 9 months, and all of that just within France. So the people who had been so vocal and determined to fight for the liberty and fairness and welfare of the people of France, once they got the power and ousted the king, now took on the opposite. Be damned to the people of France if they provided any kind of opposition to the new government. All their focus had been on the outer world. And when all your focus is on the outer world and changes on the outer world, you are stuck in your ego. And even when you get those changes that you want, you're still stuck in your ego, which means you're still stuck in the world of opposites, in perceptions of opposites, and the only choice is which opposite to have. And you will flip from one to the other and then back to the other. And depending on which side seems to suit your specialness needs at the time, this polarization can also be applied to spirituality. In this very polarized time politically, we can see two strong positions emerging spiritually. One is to focus on the non-dual nature of reality with a capital R and have a stance of a kind of withdrawal from any interest in what's going on in the world. The other is to feel obliged to change things in the world. And each of these parties tends to look on the other as if they are doing something wrong. And if we are standing like in the trolley problem and we're looking and we've got, okay, there's the non-dual focus and withdrawal from interest in the specifics of the world. And then we have the other side, which is to become acutely interested in specifics in the world and wanting to change them for what we think is the betterment of everybody. And here we are standing by the lever. Which one will we choose? Do we want this one or the other one? Which is the better option? To discuss this, I'm going to refer to a speech that Albert Camus gave to a university in Sweden in 1957. The speech was called Create Dangerously. It discusses how in turbulent times art can lose itself. And I think you can apply what he says about art to spirituality. So we'll begin with the opening paragraphs. An Oriental wise man always used to ask the divinity in his prayers to be so kind as to spare him from living in an interesting era. As we are not wise, the divinity has not spared us, and we are living in an interesting era. In any case, our era forces us to take an interest in it. The writers of today know this. If they speak up, they are criticised and attacked. If they become modest and keep silent, they are vociferously blamed for their silence. In the midst of such din, the writer cannot hope to remain aloof in order to pursue the reflections and images that are dear to him. Until the present moment, remaining aloof has always been possible in history. When someone did not approve, he could always keep silent or talk of something else. Today, everything is changed, and even silence has dangerous implications. The moment that abstaining from choice is itself looked upon as a choice and punished or praised as such, the artist is willy-nilly impressed into service. Now, I'll pause here. If we imagine instead of artist and writer, we use the word spiritual seeker or student of the course, what Camus is saying is because the times are so interesting, meaning there's so much flux, so much conflict, so much turmoil in the world. I mean, he wrote this after the Second World War, 1957, but you can definitely apply it to our time now. A writer such as himself is hugely criticised if they don't write a piece that takes a stance on something. But at the same time, if they do take a definite stance, they're criticised for that as well. And I think you can apply that to spiritual seekers as well. In these interesting times, people can ask a lot of questions related to, but what about this, that's going on, and what about that? And if you don't have a specific opinion as to what should be happening, you can be criticised for being aloof from the world. Oh, your spirituality has made you aloof. If you do have a specific opinion about what should be happening in the world, you can be criticised for being too much of the world. You shouldn't care. You're spiritual. You shouldn't care. So now I'll just continue with some bits from Camus' speech, and where I say artist, if you can just imagine the spiritual seeker or yourself as a student of a course or any other spirituality. Until now, the artist was on the sidelines, but now the artist is pressed, really, into the amphitheatre. It's been pressured into the amphitheatre. Of necessity, his voice is not quite the same. It is not nearly so firm. It is easy to see all that art can lose from such a constant obligation. Ease, to begin with, and that divine liberty so apparent in the work of Mozart. The line that really struck me was this last one. Of necessity, his voice is not quite the same. It is not nearly so firm. So now that the artist was in the amphitheatre, was in the world, amongst the fight, putting in opinions, having to write about an opinion about what was going on, of necessity, his voice was not nearly so firm. It didn't, to me, what Camus is saying is that the writer's voice or the artist's voice no longer had the depth that it did when the artist could create freely, which means create from that inner truth. Create from a space that didn't have an agenda, that didn't start with an agenda, that didn't start with trying to promote a certain opinion or take a certain stance. Camus goes on to say that in interesting times, he sees two main paths, that art, and again, whenever I say art or artist, please think of spiritual seeker, takes. Art becomes a frivolous activity, something to do for entertainment, a kind of pleasant distraction. So you can think of the commercialisation of spirituality and the ways people employ a kind of spirituality as a sideline, as a stress relief. And the other is art with the aim of promoting an ideal. So an ideal will always be your idea of an ideal, and to promote that and try and preach that to people, your idea of what is good and what is bad. Camus talks about the aim of art not being to judge, but to baffle all judges, and that the role of the artist isn't to be a preacher of what is good in the world or what is bad. He's saying that art with an agenda, and we could say spirituality with an agenda, destroys the freedom of the artist, destroys the freedom of the spiritual seeker. So what am I actually saying? What's my main point about all of this? Well, it's that we do live in interesting times, and we can feel called upon to take a particular stance or to give a particular opinion. If you vote, you will need to do that, for example. But it's important in interesting times to remember, if you're a Course in Miracles student, the main goal, and that is still to get in touch with the teacher within and to awaken to the real world, to exchange the world of the ego for the world that we see through the Holy Spirit's vision. That is what the real world is. And to keep that as our main goal, not to change the world. That doesn't mean that we can't do things in the world. Again, as I said earlier, it's all about where our classroom lies. You know, I think about Mother Teresa and her work, her vocation with the poor. She felt called to go to Calcutta. It was the call within the call, The first call was to become a nun. The second calling was to go to Calcutta and set up some kind of support for the poor there. And I have a lot of regard for Mother Teresa, and I think she was sincere, and I think she was in touch with that inner truth, and she was called to do what she did. I mean, nobody can really judge, but I have a lot of faith in her sincerity and in her honesty and in her ability to check herself and examine her own conscience and examine, she would say that with any idea or feeling to go do something, she would wait to see if that came from God. So her classroom was to go and do what she did in Calcutta. The Course isn't saying don't do things to care for people. It's just saying don't do that on your own. Because if you are doing it on your own, then it will be to fulfill some kind of specialness need. If you are called into political life as a Course in Miracles student, then it needs to be as a vocation, that it's not to fulfill some specialness need. That's what we need to be clear about. But even if it is, even if we're not clear about it and we do go into a political arena or civic action or what have you, and it does involve fulfilling some specialness need, and it does play into some idea of differences and what have you, it doesn't mean that that classroom can't be transformed and now be used for a way to experience shared interests in a classroom in which the polarities seem to be sharply drawn. That's a wonderful classroom. And so then it can be turned, if your vocation is forgiveness, like Mother Teresa's vocation was love, which is the process of forgiveness in A Course in Miracles. That's what enables us to love. Then any classroom you choose can be transformed, can be used for that. So that's what I'm trying to say in this podcast, to remember in these interesting times that the only remaining freedom is between choosing the Holy Spirit or the ego to be your companion in the world and to direct you in your course. And if that directs you into political life and having a particular political stance or what have you, that's fine. But don't judge others for whom that is not the case, and vice versa. If you don't feel at all called to have a particular political stance or be active in the world out there in some kind of civic action or political action, don't judge the people who do go do that. But the middle way and what Albert Camus is emphasising, I love the way he says that art with an agenda will destroy that freedom. Don't have an agenda in your spiritual aspirations or in what you say spiritually. Like, art with an agenda destroys the freedom of the artist. I would say spirituality with an agenda is spirituality with specialness involved, destroys the freedom of the artist. And you know it involves specialness if you are making the outer differences real and important. And if you are taking a position in which the outer change becomes more important to you than the inner process, the inner process must be primary in A Course in Miracles, because that is what provides for loving action. You know that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, the road to hell is paved with specialness, intentions that come from you deciding that you know what is best, that you have the big picture, that you know what to do of yourself. There is no value in this world apart from being able to use it to become aware of our innocence and our wholeness and of everybody else's, as that is our primary motivation and focus in the world. then we can be truly loving in whatever classroom and truly helpful in whatever classroom we feel called to enter. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope in these interesting times that you maintain your peace. Bye.